In the late 20th century and early 21st century, a large number of Muslims immigrated to Western Europe. By the year 2010, there was an estimated 44 million Muslims living in Europe, which made up 6% of its population, and including an estimated 19 million in the European Union, which made up 3.8% of the population. The Muslim population is expected to grow over 8% by the year 2030. Now, what will this mean for the future of Europe and the Muslim community at large in the coming decades? Hello everyone, my name is Leroy Kenton and this is FTD Facts, the channel where we share information about the people, countries, and cultures from all around the world. And in this episode, I'm exploring the factors of what had Islam grow so fast throughout Europe and continues to grow fast. And I'm also going to be sharing some information about the issues that people have brought up because of this. Now, the Muslim community is a relatively small community in all of Europe. However, in some countries like Sweden as well as France, the Muslim population is much higher. And this has led to a lot of social and political agitation in several countries in Europe. Even more so now because of the millions of asylum seekers recently. Today, the places with a Muslim majority in Europe are Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, and certain parts of Macedonia. There's also a large amount of Muslims living in Russia. Now, these communities consist predominantly of indigenous Europeans of the Muslim faith, whose religious practices and beliefs date back to several hundred years. And in transcontinental countries like Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, they also have a Muslim majority population. Now, I'm not going to be exploring the history of Islam in this episode. However, we do have a playlist of videos that we've made dedicated to just learning about Islam. So I have the link to that playlist. It's going to be in the card section of this episode. I'll also have the link to that down below in this video description. Or you can check it out at the end of this episode. I'll have it put up in the end screen. Now, there's a lot of information to share about this because this is such a loaded topic. So where do we begin? Let's start by taking a look at why the Muslim population is growing so fast in Europe and will continue to grow fast in the decades to come. When we look at the year 2010 to 2016 alone, the Muslim population in Europe rose more than 1%, from 3.8% of the total population to 4.9%. And in terms of numbers, that's 19.5 million Muslims increased to 25.8 Muslims. Now, based on the current numbers, by the year 2050, the Muslim population in Europe would more than double, rising to 11.2% or more. And this depends on how much immigration is allowed in Europe in the future. Now, even if in Europe there was a Muslim ban where Muslims could not immigrate there anymore forever, the Muslim population is still estimated to grow to 7.4% in Europe. This is due to the high amount of youth that live in Europe who are Muslim, as well as the high fertility rate of the current Muslim residents. So there's a lot of young people there who have not had children yet, and when they start having children, populations multiply. However, in the year 2010 to 2016, the biggest factor affecting the Muslim population growth in Europe was migration. It's estimated that 2.5 million Muslims came to Europe for reasons other than seeking asylum. And these reasons include, finding jobs, going to school, and 1.3 million of those Muslims already have or expect to receive refugee status, meaning that they'll be staying in Europe. And then we look at the natural growth, which was the second biggest factor. In the Muslim community in Europe, there were 2.9 million more births than deaths during the period of the year 2010 to 2016. And then we look at religious switching, and it's estimated to be a small factor in the Muslim population change, but roughly 160,000 more people converted to Islam during that period. And I did touch on this a little bit, but the Muslim population of youth is a lot higher than other Europeans, as well as they're much younger. And on top of that, they have more children than other Europeans. In 2016, the average age of Muslims throughout Europe was 30.4, and this is 13 years younger than the average age for other Europeans, which was 43.8. So you can also look at it like this: 50% of all the European Muslims are under the age of 30, and this is compared with 32% of non-Muslims in Europe. And on top of that, the average Muslim woman in Europe is expected to have 2.6 children, which is one child more than the average non-Muslim woman, which has 1.2 1.6 children. Now, there is some concern inside of the Muslim community in regards to the new laws that are limiting them to enter the country. Some say that the new laws targeting Muslims bring us back to the times when innocent Jewish children were abducted and imprisoned to save them from eternal hellfire. However, it's not just the Muslims who are desperately in search to find more effective solutions that do not alienate Muslims or any other group of people based on their religion or country, but the fears are that history is just gonna repeat itself. Take for instance in 15th century Catholic Spain. The monarchy set out to solve the Jewish question and they put a lot of restrictions on Jewish practices. Then they followed up with forced conversion, and the Jewish people were looked down upon because they were not considered Spanish citizens. By the next century, those who had converted to Roman Catholicism during the 14th and 15th century, they were much more familiar with the Bible than the general Catholic population. And they began to set up a new standard which produced the Protestant Reformation, which resulted in the destruction of the Catholic dominance over Europe. Also in Russia under the Tsar, they also tried to solve the Jewish question through discrimination. And of course, this caused a lot of Jewish people with great minds to join the Bolshevik Revolution, and it almost succeeded in the destruction of Russian Orthodoxy and culture. Despite these concerns that people have, the view towards Muslims varies widely when you look across Europe. According to the European Monitoring Center of Racism and Xenophobia, they report that the Muslim population tend to suffer Islamophobia all over Europe. However, the perceptions of views of Muslims may vary. And in the year 2016, the Pew Research Center, they conducted a survey in 10 nations and they found that negative views about Muslims was actually prevailing in Eastern and Southern Europe. However, the majority of people who responded in the UK, Germany, France, Sweden, as well as the Netherlands, they gave the Muslims a favorable rating. What they also realized is that the views about Muslims are tied to people's ideology. So there were 47% of Germans on the political right that gave Muslims an unfavorable rating, and that number was at 17% for those on the political left who gave Muslims an unfavorable rating. This gap between the left and the right is also seen in the countries Greece and Italy, and the gap between the percentage is about 30%. According to a WZB Berlin Social Science Center report that looked into the employment of Muslims in countries like Germany, France, and the Netherlands, as well as the UK, Belgium, and Switzerland, they noticed that Muslims in Europe generally have a higher level of unemployment, which is also greatly due because of the lack of language skills, as well as just a general lack of cultural connection and traditions, as well as the views about gender roles compared to other Europeans. This report also noted a very small percent of unemployment was because of discrimination. And the last thing I'm going to touch on about the various views that Europeans have towards Muslims is about their style of dress. This year, 2018, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey and they found that most Europeans actually favor restrictions on face covering veils. An estimated 13 out of 15 favored banning of face covering veils in Western Europe. They see an Islamic way of dressing to not be representative of religious symbols, but rather they see it as repressive ideology in the form of Islamism, which is intended to influence families, society, and politics. As you can see, there are various different views that Europeans have towards Muslims, and again, these views are impacted by people's political standings and their own ideologies, things like that. And the issues and concerns that people have about this are the number of Muslims that are coming into Europe, the expansion of Islam, what is it going to look like for European culture in the decades to come, while others are saying we got to be inclusive to everyone, we can't discriminate or else we're going to repeat history. So let me know down in the comment section below, where do you stand on this? Are you for the acceptance of all religions and cultures and that people should be free to expand their religion and culture anywhere in the world? Or do you feel that in this case that the increase of the Muslim population across Europe will negatively impact Europeans' quality of life and be a threat to the legacy, culture, history, and a threat to the modern present day safety of the citizens? Thanks for watching this episode of FTD Facts. There's a lot of information to digest there, but definitely look forward to seeing you in another episode. Until the next time, my name is Leroy Kenton, and I'll see you soon. Hey, and for everybody who made it to the end of this video, here's our playlist on Islam. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already, and come back here every single week to FTD Facts for more educational videos about the people, countries, and cultures from all around the world. See you soon.